This is GARIS Essays, that is 2-3-page opinion pieces on topics such as species dominance, the global state, politics, femtotech, religion, society and education. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is essay number 24, entitled Why Culture Bashing is Valuable, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name Hugo de GARIS. Abstract. This essay aims to show why culture bashing is valuable. It's an essential tool in the globalification of the planet that is needed to create a global state, seen as the dominant political goal of the century, freeing the world of war, the arms trade, ignorance and poverty. It's argued that the rise of an internet that doubles its speed every year makes worldwide culture bashing inevitable. 1. Introduction. Culture bashing is defined to be heavy criticism of the values, customs, norms of a culture as expressed, usually, by members of another culture. To most people in today's largely monocultured world, that is, the majority of the Earth's citizens are still monocultured, that is, they have grown up in only one culture. The culture bashing of multis, that is, multicultured people, seems rude, undiplomatic and inconsiderate of the mono's feelings. This mono-based negative attitude towards culture bashing is widespread and a strongly held opinion. However, culture bashing serves a very useful purpose and hence is valuable, as this essay attempts to show. 2. Monocritics and multi-critics. A monocritic is a mono who criticizes his own culture. A monocritic usually does not have enough detailed knowledge of the norms of another culture to be able to criticize it. A multi-critic is a multi who criticizes his own or other cultures based on his first-hand experience of having lived in them. When a mono criticizes his own culture, he does so with a rather limited basis for comparison, compared with a multi who criticizes the same culture. The mono will not have the first-hand experience of having lived in another culture or cultures, and hence usually cannot compete with a much broader basis of comparison possessed by the multi. For anyone criticizing the norms, values, customs of a given culture, that person will need to imagine a superior alternative to act as a basis for comparison. For the mono, this usually involves an act of imagination, the dreaming up of a more desirable way of doing things. This imaginary alternative may be misguided or impractical and probably untested. A multi, on the other hand, can compare the norms, values and customs of several cultures that he has lived in. His alternatives to the norms of the culture he is criticizing are real, practical, and used daily by at least one other culture, a culture that the multi has lived in. It may happen that the multi feels that the norm or custom he is criticizing in a given culture is not just mildly inferior to those of other cultures he has lived in, but greatly inferior. For example, take the case of a Western intellectual living in China who looks on China's lack of freedom of speech and the country's brutal dictatorial government. Hence it is then likely that the multi will not be just critical of the culture concerned, but sharply critical, hence the term culture bashing, with the emphasis on the word bashing, that is, violent criticism. In the 1990s, there were a lot of Western researchers living in Japan, taking advantage of the country's rising salaries and its prospects of becoming the #1 nation on the planet, or so it seemed in the early 1990s. However, as the years of that decade passed, these Westerners learned from first-hand experience of the many social and cultural inferiorities of Japan and started criticizing the culture strongly. These Western critics were labeled Japan bashers, and once a Westerner acquired that label, he was ignored by most Japanese. They did not listen to his criticisms. The Western Japan bashers were quite unable to turn back the clock and absorbed into their own mentalities the values and norms of the Japanese they had found to be so inferior and unacceptable. For example, the sex roles that were 40 years behind the West, the unconscious Japanese racism, etc., so that they felt increasingly alienated, and hence the venom of their criticism increased. they culture bashed. 3. The multi-mono tipping point. The rejection by monos of the culture bashing of the monos' culture by multis is unfortunate, because then the monos are unable to learn from the criticisms of the multis. It's typical of monos that they have no clue what the multis are talking about, because the experiences that the multis use as a basis for comparison in their criticism of the mono's culture lie totally outside the life experience of the mono. The mono has simply not lived in the cultures of the multi. Hence, there is no meeting of minds. The multi gets frustrated at the cultural limitations, the constrained horizons of the mono, and the mono doesn't understand why the multi is attacking his culture. The two just don't communicate and end up parting ways, with the multis far preferring the company of other multis, and the monos dismissing the multis as bloody foreigners. But this traditional clash of attitudes of the multis and monos is changing. The world is approaching a tipping point. In today's world, that is 2011, when I wrote this essay, when this essay was written, about 500 million people each year cross international boundaries for business, tourism, etc. According to a BBC report, about 70 million people each year are living outside the country of their birth. Thus, the percentage of the world's citizens who have multi-mentalities and experiences is growing, so that a higher proportion of people are becoming sympathetic to the multi-mentality, to the multi's view of the world. In a decade or so, a tipping point will be reached where there will be more multis than monos, and once that happens, the monos will start feeling much more psychological pressure on them to open up their minds to the culture bashing of the multis. Those monos refusing to listen to the content of the criticisms of the multis will be accused by the multis of being closed-minded ignorami and worse. For example, ad-libbing here, one country bumpkins. 4. The value of culture bashing. We live in an increasingly democratic and wired world. There are nearly 200 countries in the world, and 2/3 of them today, that's in 2011, are democracies, with multi-party elections, where the voters can vote out governments the voters feel are not doing a good job of governing. Unfortunately, the country I live in, China, is not one of them. 90% of people living outside China live in democracies. That makes China the big bad exception, and reflects very poorly upon the global status level of the country. When China democratizes, probably before 2020, well, that's looking less likely, so maybe in the 2020s, the world will be a very different place. It's an empirical fact that democratic nations do not go to war with each other. Their voting populations do not tolerate it. Therefore, the historical trend of global democratization is a wonderful thing. Once China democratizes and Russia strengthens its democratic level, the big powerful countries of the world can come to an agreement and ban the arms trade, which is one of the great moral abominations of the 20th and 21st centuries, worse in moral terms than the slave trade, because at least it was in the self-interest of the slave traders to keep the slaves alive, to perform wageless labor, whereas the arms trade is all about killing people. The greatest offenders, that is, the greatest arm traders, are the US, then Europe, Russia, etc. The speed of the internet is doubling every year. That is the BRAD, B-R-A-D, bit rate annual doubling phenomenon. In 30 years, the internet will be 1 billion times faster, allowing richly vivid 3D, three-dimensional images to be sent to everyone's living room. BRAD will allow the creation of a world media and the development of a world language, as each country sends up its national TV programs in its own language, English, and perhaps a few other languages. Everyone will then learn English to be able to understand what the world is thinking. Anyone in a decade or two who cannot understand English, the world language, will be considered handicapped and be looked down on as unsophisticated, ignorant, and narrow-minded. Education ministries of countries will make the learning of English compulsory in schools all over the world. Any country not doing this will handicap itself in the global economy, because its citizens will be less competitive in the world market when competing with other countries whose English-speaking levels are superior, and hence can clinch business deals more easily because their international communications skills are superior. Once English is well established as the world language, ideas will fly across the planet, and people will become much more open to the views of people from other countries/cultures. Hence, the culture bashing can really begin. Personally, When I'm confronted with the situation where I'm effectively forced to choose between diplomacy and negative truths, I prefer the negative truths. I expect the person I'm talking with to be sufficiently intellectual and open-minded to be multicultural thinking, to be able to stomach my bashing of the culture of that person. If that person is a real mono, or worse, a mono-nationalist, then the dialogue will end in tears. This happens to me regularly in China, where the government has been brainwashing the Chinese with a nationalist message on its government-monopolized media for decades. As a result, the Chinese are not nationalists, they're jingoist. Criticizing China to most of them is taboo and elicits a hostile emotional reaction. It's like going up to a priest and saying to his face that there's no God. You've wasted your whole life. One generates cognitive dissonance. But the Chinese are too poor to have travelled much. In the past few years, especially in the eastern half of the country, the Chinese have preoccupied themselves with acquiring apartments and cars. The next big step for them will be to travel. In a few years from now, 2011, there will be a flood of Chinese tourists all around the world, to the point where the tourist traps will be complaining about the yellow peril. Once that happens, hundreds of millions of Chinese minds will be awakened to the fact of their government's nationalist indoctrination and will become conscious that their country is not a member of the world community with its world satellite TV channels, for example BBC World, CNN International, France 24, Deutsche Welle, NHK World, Al Jazeera English, etc., which the Chinese are banned from watching. They will return to China feeling frustrated that they are not permitted to watch the world's TV, and then push increasingly for a more open and democratic government. I expect all this to play out during this decade and the next. But for the two-thirds of the world that is already democratic, the world community is growing because the populations of these rich first world democratic countries are able to view the TV and internet programs of the world, and increasingly in English. In Europe, for example, the young people, that is single in their 20s, are quite accustomed to flying around the cities of Europe on budget airfares in the same way as Americans do across the US. These young Europeans all speak quite good English and can communicate effectively with each other. They look upon each city as just another European city, with its own idiosyncrasies, for example, its local language and customs. This transnational European culture of the young will become the norm as they grow older and take power. A similar phenomenon will occur across the democratic world as people become fluent in the world language and can absorb ideas from world culture. Once enough people from the poorer, less sophisticated, less developed portions of the planet can communicate in English, they will then be subject inevitably to culture bashing. There will be more and more Maltese who have lived in the countries being culture bashed. The criticisms of these culture bashers will be understood by the third worlders and will be difficult to swallow. Just as most Japanese or Chinese rejected the culture bashing from the first top worlders, these other third worlders will probably react in the same way. But if so, that's a pity, because then they will not be able to learn from the content of the critiques. However, when culture bashing becomes a worldwide phenomenon concerning hundreds of millions of people, there will always be some percentage of the third worlders with sufficiently curious and open minds that they really make an effort to listen and learn from the culture bashing against their own monoculture. It is this minority of people, the more curious, the more intellectual ones, who will transform the monoculture they live in. They will really study the content of the culture bashing and absorb it into their own personalities. They will identify with the critiques. The fact that the first worlders are culture bashing rather than just mildly diplomatically criticizing reflects that they are speaking from the heart. The culture bashers are expressing what they truly feel, so the monos who are the victims of the culture bashing have no doubts about what the multis are feeling. At least there's emotional honesty in the culture bashing, so that the monos who do choose to learn from the bashing will know it is honest and that it's useful and valuable, which is the main point of this whole essay. When a multi complains bitterly about some inferiority of some other culture that he has lived in, then that should show clearly to the mono of the culture being complained about that there's a real problem. Otherwise, why would the multi be complaining about it so energetically and emotionally? Also, the mono, if he is open-minded enough, might reason that perhaps the multi has a point. Perhaps the multi, in all his multicultural sophistication and possessing a much richer base for comparison, might be onto something. that the mono can learn from, that the multi can teach the mono something. So, culture bashing is valuable in that it comes from the heart and points towards very real problems or inferiorities of the culture being bashed. This honesty and indication are very valuable because they serve as didactic aids to those monos who really want to learn from the multis. It's especially the curious, intellectually open-minded young monos who will probably be the group which has most to benefit from culture bashing. They can improve the quality of their lives by absorbing the superior values, norms, etc. of other cultures. They may then be more motivated to travel to these other cultures and live in them for a while to better absorb these superior values. 5. Culture bashing leads to cultural homogenization. Once most of the world can understand the world language, culture bashing can rage, and with a passion. This culture bashing will be very educational. Some fraction of the world population will choose to cut itself off from the criticism, but that will be very difficult to do, since other fractions of the same population will be strongly influenced by the culture bashing and push for changes in that culture. A hefty debate always has as a consequence some mutual influence on the debating parties. When two sides both hold passionately to their respective views, that usually means that there's something of value that is worth holding on to on both sides. Learning what these views are can be enlightening for both parties. Another factor one needs to take into account is that this debate, this culture bashing, will be global in scope. Imagine how it will feel for the Chinese, for example, if they do end up being the very last country in the world to democratize, because China is the only third world country to have anti-satellite weapons that can shoot down the internet satellites that will help democratize the rest of the planet. If the non-Chinese, that is 80% of the world's population, point the finger at China in future centuries and say, "You Chinese must truly have been an inferior people because you were the very last country on the planet to democratize, even slower than the Arabs and the blacks," then that will be excruciatingly painful for the Chinese to stomach. It will be a major black mark against their culture for centuries. When the vast majority of the world's population delivers the same critique in its culture bashing of a particular culture, then that critique will be crushing to that culture. It will be impossible to deny the enormous weight of world opinion when it's resolutely against the particular cultural norm. For example, imagine the pressure Americans will feel if 95% of the world condemns Americans for their hillbilly attitudes towards the private possession of guns. Now, I've said this before in other essays, but I have changed I'm ad-libbing now, changed my attitude on that opinion greatly, because since then I've become conscious of the existence of the Illuminati, the Jewish bankster political dictatorial goal of taking over the country, ruling it from Jerusalem. Now, Americans have more guns than Americans, so if the Jewish elite really do try to turn America into a police state, then the Americans will just shoot them dead. They'll just kill them. They'll pogrom them, and that will be a very good thing, because, well, the Jewish elite are crashing the whole planet with their debt enslavement of. Oh, I could ramble on for hours. Anyway, so I've done a complete U-turn on my attitude towards Americans and their guns. I now see that as a very positive thing rather than negative. I obviously changed my attitude towards the private possession of guns. Europeans and Japanese are already heavily bashing Americans on this point, as well as on many other topics. For example, the US death penalty, the lack of a US national health service, the corrupt US politicians who are bought up by corporations, America's democracy for the rich, etc. It may be easy to dismiss the culture bashing of a single other culture, but if the content of the bashing is much the same coming from the whole planet, then the wisdom of the crowd, that is the world population, will have tremendous weight. It will be virtually impossible to ignore it or refute it, and will provide a powerful force to push the aberrant culture into the global norm. Global public opinion will be incredibly powerful. All this culture bashing will have as an effect the gradual cultural homogenization of the planet, which the globalists, that is the people who are pushing for the creation of a global state, see as a precondition for the fulfillment of their dream, that is Globa, that's Globa, the global state. which will create a war-free world, rid it of the arms trade, educate everyone out of ignorance, and hence make everyone wealthy, healthy, and wise. Thus, from the viewpoint of the globus, culture bashing is seen as a critically important factor in the cultural homogenization process, which is a major stepping stone towards the creation of globa. The globus, therefore, are opposed to PC, political correctness, values, as expressed by many people in the First World. PC-oriented First Worlders look on PC as simple politeness. To globists, PC is something to be overcome, as short-sighted, as ignorant. Culture bashing needs to be given more credit. It's an essential ingredient in the creation of a global state, the big dream of the globists. Think of it, a world without war, without poverty. So if you share this vision, start culture bashing, start educating, start homogenizing. Footnote. The first half of Prof. de Garis' second book, Multis and Monos, What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured, Towards the Creation of a Global State, available on Amazon.com and for free on my website. Culture strokes, that is praises, as well as culture bashes some half dozen of the world's major cultures, US, Germany, UK, France, Japan, China, all of which he has lived in and or whose languages he speaks. The aim of this culture stroking and bashing is explicit in the title of the book. Cultures can learn from the superiorities of other cultures, if only they can open their mono-minds to the criticism of the multis. The second half of the book deals with the rise of globa, the global state, seen as the greatest political goal of the 21st century. And that's it. So, cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name Hugo de Garis. Ciao.